right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 149 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I am Billy Bob here on the West Coast. It's a little bit after 9 a.m., and we've got a full panel. I've got my regular co-host, Ian Cummer, streaming live from a suburb in Moscow. Carlo Parcelli should be joining us. He is in Washington, D.C., also known as Satan's Anus. And I got a special guest, Greg Rosen, streaming live from Chicago, Illinois. It's about 11 a.m. there. And Leo Zhao, streaming live from East Berlin. I think it's 6 p.m. in East Berlin. And we're going to just get right into our topic. We've got a big panel, lots to discuss. We titled this episode World War III ? Which, of course, is in reference to the big news, Israel's attack on Iran last night. Before we get into that, I do want to mention the tragic passing of friend of the show, Christopher Black. He was on our program a couple weeks ago, and he looked great. And we're all very shocked and surprised and dismayed to hear of his passing. It's a tragic loss, a great comrade. And, he provided so much wisdom and insight with his, long history of expertise, not just in international law, but, his firsthand experience in Yugoslavia and in Cuba and in Africa. He was just a tremendous resource, and he will be greatly missed. I don't know if anybody else wants to interject on that topic. We can definitely dwell on that a little bit, or we can move into the breaking news that, really is, what everybody is talking about today. And we just did lose Carlo and Leo. I'm not sure.
We lost them, but they'll be back. Yeah. I think we should launch into what everybody's dying to hear. I've been pinged, actually, just in the past hour. I've been pinged by a few people asking me, "What do you think about what's going on with Iran? What do you think is going on with that?" I think a lot of people are interested in commentary and predictions.
Yeah. Well, and I would like to start and just set the stage with regards to my own, understanding and perception. Where to begin? It's such a huge issue. But essentially, go ahead, Carlo.
I want to say something about Chris Black. I have the greatest respect for Christopher Black. I thought he was a courageous person for what he had done for people wrongly accused before the ICC, and I personally will greatly miss having the opportunity to talk to him. I just wanted to say that, and the best goes to his family. So, okay, that's
it. Thanks, Carlo. Yeah, his brother was informing the Facebook community about his passing, and so we wish them the best. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. And I'm not sure. Hopefully, Leo pops back in. He was having some technical issues. But yeah. So the Iran attack. It seemed as though a while ago that an Iran attack was imminent, and that that was definitely what was going to happen. But then we saw, these negotiations, and we saw kind of the floundering of these Trump tariffs. And, it seemed to me like I became persuaded that it was more of these threats to attack Iran were more of a bluff. And I was persuaded of a couple assumptions, which turns out might not be correct, might not be accurate. So one of those assumptions was that, Iran had a formidable capability to really if attacked, to crash the global economy, by, ending all the oil and energy exports from the Middle East, also known as West Asia. So that was an assumption I had. And then when I saw how the markets were reacting negatively to Trump's tariff debacle, I thought, yeah, there's no way that that Trump will willingly crash the global economy and threaten stock markets and all the rich people's assets by initiating a war with Iran. And so after months and months of saying an attack is imminent against Iran, I became persuaded, and I'm like, it's a bluff. There's no way that Trump is going to threaten, the stock market. And so, many of those assumptions might be incorrect, and we're waiting to see what Iran's response will be. But it's an open question about what their responsibility. So I would say that the United States and the European Union are waiting for a strong response. And if Iran launches a strong response against Israel, they're going to take that opportunity then to engage Iran themselves, and not just through Israel proxy. And so these are the considerations that Iran is going to be weighing. I mean, what do we do? Do we, invite a total war against us with all the Gulf states, Europe, the U.S., and Israel? So it remains an open question. Anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, I remember having this argument with you, and on this show, the specific was more specific than that. It wasn't just an Israeli attack on Iran. It was Scott Ritter's declaration that they were going to do a nuclear strike. And I was saying at the time, there's no way Israel is going to cross the nuclear threshold, because there's a couple of reasons. And it's actually good. We actually, because last time when we were having that argument, Leo was not on the show with us, but this time he is on the show with us. So maybe he can give the Chinese perspective. But I was saying both from the Russian and the Chinese perspective, Israel cannot do a preemptive nuclear strike. And the reason why is that basically be a green light. The USA can wipe out whoever they want. All they have to do is use a proxy who uses the nukes, and that conveniently wipes out an adversary. And the USA can say, oh, we didn't do it. But still a U.S. proxy that's crossing the nuclear threshold, and Russia and China could not tolerate that, because that would just mean any ally or partner of Russia or China can just be wiped out preemptively with nukes, while the USA just claims to not be involved. And they couldn't, they just, from a survival, even if China or Russia wants to sit that conflict out, they can't, because that's just a green light. Hey, the USA can just nuke whoever they want. Obviously, they can't tolerate that. Yeah. So I do think going into this, it's different from what the most alarmist people were saying, right? So it wasn't a nuclear strike. It was a very serious. I mean, it was an act. Or I should say, an act of war, like it's the first time it's happened. It's another act of war by Israel, but it's not crossing the nuclear threshold. I think it can be debated how damaging it was. It's very serious. I wouldn't downplay it as not serious. It killed serious leaders. It caused damage. It killed people. But how damaging is, I don't think we can actually know exactly what the damage to Iran's national security and their infrastructure was, unless they themselves say it. But even that's like, how do we know? They can, of course, they'll downplay what damage was. So we can't really know. And I also think there's enough of a pattern now to say that the full extent of their response isn't going to be immediate. It was, if I don't remember that last the strike that actually hit the embassy, and that previous attack that caused the drone and ballistic missile response, that was a few days coming, if I remember correctly. It wasn't instantaneous. Today they did within 24 hours launch those drones, though I think everybody knows that's not going to be the full extent of the response.
Yeah, there was competing reports that those drones actually came from Iraq and not Iran.
Yeah, so it's not verified. Yeah, so I think we're going to be waiting at least a few days before we see the full extent of. And they're going to be thinking about it too. They're like, what should we do? I mean, I'm sure they've already thought about what we do in that scenario, but they're going to have a few days at least of thinking. I would say we haven't crossed the nuclear threshold yet. And also that's just a trump card that they're not going to play unless, all else fails. And I think that also applies to Iran. They're not going to, do some civilization ending attack on Israel, actually annihilating infrastructure that puts people back in the Stone Age, destroying water desalination plants, annihilating their
Okay, did Ian break up? I think Ian broke up. Leo, you were going to say something and my phone is ringing and it's just
I was going to say what I'm wondering is that some days ago we found out that the location of the Israeli nuclear weapons facilities were leaked to Iran, right? So what I'm wondering is how realistic. I'm not versed in military matters, but I'm wondering how realistic is the tactic of taking out Israel's nuclear weapons facilities with surgical strikes.
I would say unlikely because they're deliberately vague. I mean, they're in complete violation of the international standard on nuclear transparency, and I think that works in their favor. Don't can be sure.
But some days ago, the locations of their facilities were leaked. No.
Yeah, I hadn't heard. No, I missed that.
Yeah,
of course.
Iran said they'd acquired it through espionage.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a whole bunch of documents
said they would attack them. Sorry.
Well, a whole, millions of documents were smuggled out of Israel recently and presented to the global community by Iran, claiming that, these documents prove the existence of Israel's illicit nuclear program. It also proves, it gives blueprints about where they are and what their capabilities are. And it also proves that the IAEA has been a bad faith actor, being a source of intelligence for Israel. So, and also Iran has said that, any attack on its nuclear facility, it'll respond, with an attack on Israel. An attack on Iran's nuclear facility would be met with a response on Israel's nuclear facilities.
Right.
The thing is, Brian Berletic, I was watching him this morning, and he's saying his take is as follows, and it's a persuasive and compelling take. Essentially, he's saying that Iran has been bluffing the entire time, that Iran understood its weakness and it was doing its best with the hand that it had, and it was hoping that bluffing and talking big would be a deterrent, and ultimately it wasn't. But I was definitely taken in, if that perception is correct. I was definitely taken in by the bluffing, and I thought Iran was in a very strong position, and I became persuaded that it was unlikely that Israel or the United States would do this. And so, but again, Brian says, the whole time Iran was expecting an attack, and they were just doing the best they could, with their limited resources, and hoping that they could bluff their way out of it. And I mean that's compelling. Like, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Brian and his analysis.
But it seems like the last attack that Iran launched against Israel was pretty successful. and it had bypassed the Iron Dome and the Israeli defenses quite well. And I mean, from what I've heard, is that that was a fraction of Iran's capacity. So I don't know.
Right.
So
And the footage from
go ahead.
Iran's air defenses working also looked like they were pretty robust.
Right. And so, I mean, to hear Israel media, pro-Israel media tell their story, they've been very successful at eliminating from within Iran, Iran's missile defense. And they've also, attacked some of their missile production facilities. Obviously, I think it's true that there's some deep underground, 5 deep underground nuclear, enrichment sites that ostensibly have not been attacked. But as far as the missile defense, it seems like, I mean, again, to hear Israel and the United States, they've significantly deteriorated their missile defense capability. I would just say that Iran, Berletic makes the case that Iran, even with missiles, what can they really do? Because he uses the analogy of a matador, and the United States is the matador, and Israel is the red cape that they wave in front of the bull. And so as the bull charges after the red cape or whatever it is that the matador uses, the matador is busy sticking knives, in the bull's back. And so you can take out Israel, you can take out the leadership of Israel, but how is that going to save your your country or your government, and so you can definitely take out some of the Israeli leadership, but that's just going to draw in the European Union, the United States, and all of their capacity and capability, and so I don't know.
It's difficult to say because the crucial thing is Iran has a lot to lose. I mean, any country that goes to war has a lot to lose because the enemy can damage you. They can kill your people. They can destroy your infrastructure. They can wreck your economy. And Iran is pretty good, despite the decades of sanctions. They're in a pretty good place right now economically. Scientific, like if you look up just the number of scientific papers every country produces, Iran punches far above their weight. They produce more scientific papers than any other Middle Eastern country, which is pretty impressive because they're not poor countries. These aren't, backwards countries where nobody is literate. They're all pretty well developed countries. So the fact that Iran is head and shoulders above everybody else in the region is not a small accomplishment. So they have a lot to lose, getting into, this pissing match with Israel that results in wide scale destruction, like what you said already, European Union, United States getting involved. They have a lot to lose. And from Israel's perspective, well, let's be honest, whatever damage they sustain, at least physical damage, will be funded. The repair will be funded. There's the world's largest economies right there to say, oh, well, they're victims of the Holocaust, and, we're obligated to devote our lives to them. And here's, $50 billion or whatever it takes to rebuild the damage. I mean, it's just be honest, whatever damage Israel sustains.
International Zionism. I mean, everybody complains about the disproportion of Zionist billionaires. I mean, all around the world, and they'll, that's their cause. They're gonna any damage that can be done, they're going to, quickly rebuild as soon as they can. But the deterrent again has always been the idea that Iran can crash the global economy. So is that a false assumption? Like, did the West in this first attack degrade Iran's ability to destroy all the oil infrastructure in the Middle East? And if they did that, if they do crash the global economy, would that hurt China more than it hurts the United States and the West? It definitely wouldn't hurt the United States being a net oil exporter. It might hurt the European Union, who doesn't, they're reliant on imports. But that's the question. And so the West has not wanted to see the global economy crash, and that deterrent from Iran has so far kept this from happening. But guess what? Yesterday, this happened. And so the question is, what does that say about our assumptions of, Iran's willingness or ability to, end oil exports from the Middle East / West Asia?
Iran probably does. It's probably not a bluff. They probably do have the ability to disrupt, maybe not completely cut off, but completely disrupt the oil market in the world, right? With the interdicting.
Oil markets
the
are
Persian
fine
Gulf.
right now. Oil markets
right.
are
They
good.
shot up a little bit, but it's more of fear. It's panic than actual physical disruption, right? So the problem is, it's like I was saying earlier. It's like a nuke. It's a trump card, and the problem is that if you deploy your best cards, well, there's nothing. It's a thrown knife leaves the hand empty. If you have a knife in your hand and you throw it at your opponent, you threw a knife at him, but you also left your hand empty. There's nothing else you can do to him, and also it causes a lot of pain. So neighboring countries that Iran wants to have a good relationship with are, of course, hurting. Also, they're going to be unhappy about that, and so the problem with using your trump cards preemptively is that the actors you're trying to influence have a lot of motivation to stop the pain, and you also don't have any. So the carrot, there's that carrot of we need to stop the pain, but there's also no stick. There's nothing else you can threaten them with, because Iran does not.
Sounds like you're
nukes.
describing a very tough position. Sounds like
Right.
Iran is in a tough position.
So it's not
Right.
saying I'm not saying it's a bluff or that's a useless threat. The problem is if they use it too early, or then they have nothing left to follow it up with. So that is a conundrum. It is a problem.
And Iran is very important to the multipolar world. It's one of the pillars, right? So it's very important for all of the anti-imperialist forces around the world.
Yeah,
Right,
let's
'cause
talk
Iran-
about that. Go ahead, Ian.
So Iran is, we have to say why is it a pillar. One, it's very old culture, right? I mean, they've had, I don't even know how long they've had written language. It goes back, it's the Fertile Crescent. So Persians are very old civilization.
Before the Persians, the Phoenicians.
Yeah, so the Persians are a very old culture. They have a lot of cultural heritage, and I think that does influence how they think. Because I think someone who has a new regime, a fairly new page in history, is going to think differently than someone who has a very long, who has that heritage of thousands of years. And even because I've talked to a lot of people who've been to Iraq, who've been to the Middle East, and like even people in NATO, even American military people go to the Middle East. And for example, about 10 years ago, I was talking to an American, he's a lieutenant colonel, so like a battalion commander. He claimed he had caught some Iranian officers who were arming insurgents in Iraq. He said he was impressed that he met these Iranians who spoke multiple languages, who were extremely well educated. So even these people who are invading the Middle East are impressed by Iran, right? So that is true. So Iran is a pillar for a reason. I do think politically they stand head and shoulders above the other Middle Eastern states. The big problem with the Arab states, not because they're not old cultures, it's not that they're unsophisticated. The problem is, you could write a PhD thesis on what's wrong with the Middle East, but there's colonialism. But the main thing is that these states, they're kind of pseudo states. They're kind of artificial states, right? Because you can't. For example, come into France and say, "Oh, I killed one guy," so the whole state collapses. You can't get rid of Macron and make France collapse, right? You can't get rid of Trump and make the USA collapse. You can't get rid of Putin and make Russia collapse, but you can get rid of Assad and make Syria collapse, right? You could collapse the Saudi princes in Saudi Arabia, make Saudi Arabia collapse. That's the problem. They don't think in terms of nation states. They're very. I've known a lot of Arabs who are very well educated. They're very cultured, but the idea of a nation state is still new to them. And that's a problem with Israel, because if you think in terms of a nation state, you're like, okay, this other nation state is a threat to me. I'm not going to accept bribes from them. I'm not going to listen to their attempts to turn me to the side. I recognize them as a threat. I'm going to take the unilateral and bilateral actions. I'm going to partner with who I need, with the other people who share that interest. That's nation state thinking. The problem is that none of those Arab states think like that. Look how quickly Syria collapsed.
Well, most of them were created through the process of colonialism.
Right. And that's why I mentioned colonialism, because you had Western powers come in and introduce the idea of a nation state, but it wasn't a real nation state because the idea did not spring up organically. So they don't think in terms of nation states. They're very much family. And I think that applies to Jordan, it applies to Saudi Arabia. They're all kind of family operations. You take out that one family, it collapses. But Persians,
Iran is different,
yes, Iran is different. They're ahead of the Arabs in that idea, at least. So I think that's what makes them the leader of the race. And I think, I'm not saying anybody there is stupid. I think even the Arabs themselves realize that Iran's playing a very important role in that.
That what it takes to engage on the geopolitical chessboard today, and to exert force that this nation state idea is essentially important. No, I mean there is something to that, definitely. I think there is that. I think that is interesting, and I think that is
because and as much as I like Arabs, I do have to be critical. Because let's be honest, if the Arab states said we're done, no more Israel, the genocide would stop. All of this bullshit that's happening would stop if the Arab states said we're done. We're not tolerating it anymore. But the problem is they do continue tolerating it.
They're comprador,
yeah.
Right.
They're ruled by the comprador class, just like many African states that were created during colonialism as well. The colonial powers made sure to install these collaborationist comprador class, which makes their profit from collaborating and trading with the imperialist countries. So that's the problem with the Arab states.
But we were trying to focus on how Iran is valuable to the axis of resistance, how they're valuable to Russia and China. And sorry, Ian, you look like you.
My internet cut out. I'm sorry. I had to reload.
Technical issues.
Yes.
But I know Russia is very important that the current government in Iran survives for Russia, because they do share a border. And if the United States and the West could put in a comprador government in Iran that does the West's bidding against Russia, that would be a tightening of the noose for sure. That's an understatement. It would be really a bad strategic defeat for Russia to lose the Iranian government and to have that government replaced with an ally of the West that turns its is used as a weapon against Russia. Now with China, of course, China gets like 80% of Iranian oil exports, or 85% of Iranian oil exports. And it's also a key corridor in the Belt and Road Initiative, which, is part of how, China's plan to export, to the globe and bring prosperity, bring development throughout the planet, through exporting its manufacturing. So Iran is just a key, part of BRICS and a key part of the axis of resistance. And so it's really not good if Iran does get overthrown, the government of Iran gets overthrown, and a Western proxy government is propped up in its place, or a failed state, because I think it's less likely that you're going to get a Western friendly government, but you could get a Libya-styled failed state. And
well, they don't exactly have a border. I mean, the Russian Empire had a border. The Soviet Union had a border. The only overland border they have is with Azerbaijan. I'm not actually sure how Russia transports things. I don't know if they transport things through Azerbaijan or if they just go by ship.
Thank you for correcting my erroneous geography. That I will agree that.
Well, no, it's true, because Iran's been important because it's that kind of underbelly. Because even Churchill said when they were fighting the Germans in World War I, he decided the Ottoman Empire was the underbelly the soft underbelly could be attacked. It was the same with the MK commented, yes, the Caspian Sea. So that's why I was thinking the sea route's easier than the overland route. But with the Russian Empire during the Great Game in the 19th century, it was primarily focused in the Caucasus and in Central Asia and Persia at the time was a crucial part of that. So the British were, it was at the time, I don't think they actually called it color revolutions back then, but it was basically, you're causing political unrest in Russia's underbelly. And Russia responded by basically taking these territories. So, if you look at the North Caucasus, or if you look at, even now, if you look at the North Caucasus, you look at Dagestan or Chechnya, these primarily Muslim areas. I don't think it's that Russia just loves ruling these areas. That we love dominating these regions. The problem is that if Russia doesn't rule these areas, someone else will, and that someone else will use them against.
They will be used as launching pads. They will be used as
exactly,
absolutely.
Because after the first Chechen War, Russia said, "Okay, you know what? Fine. We don't care. Chechnya can be independent. We don't care that much. You can be independent." What was the first thing they did? They invaded Dagestan. They did terrorist attacks in Moscow. So that's the problem, and that's what Russia is stuck with. I think the premise of the Great Game then in the 19th century, and it's the premise of what's going on now. If Russia doesn't just says, what is not worth the effort, we're just going to not control these regions, then they get used as a launch pad. So Iran is not being conquered by Russia like, in the past centuries. They're allies now, and I think they understand that what the game is, because it's been played before. And unfortunately Tajikistan plays into that. Afghanistan, which is, if you studied the Afghan wars, is the Pashtun tribes in the south who made up the Taliban, and the Tajiks, the ethnic Tajiks in the Northern Alliance, were the American allies. They're the Dari speakers in the north. They were the American and British allies. So it's kind of surreal to look at 19th century politics, then look at the 21st century and realize it's like nothing's changed. It's surreal, actually. But I think with Iran specifically, we have to look at 2022 when Russia was in trouble. I think that's a fair statement to make. In spring 2022, they realized Ukraine was not a paper tiger that would fold immediately, and the sanctions from hell, as Biden called them, were springed on them. So they were caught in what was a long war, and also complete. They were completely severed.
So all of this is, I hope, leading to how we think, or our like what we can gather about possible reactions from Russia and China to the recent events of the last 24 hours.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we're talking about the importance of Iran, to the axis of resistance, to the BRICS,
Centrally
economic,
important, right?
very important.
We agree.
And so, what can Iran? Oh, we got two Ians now. Let me remove this Ian. But
Sorry,
so
I cut out again.
here's what Iran can do. Iran can drop out of the IAEA. They can do work to make a nuclear weapon. They could, ostensibly, if their capacity hasn't been significantly degraded, they could launch an attack against Israel and really do some heavy damage and make Israel think, well, shit, maybe we shouldn't have attacked. I mean, that's what they've been threatening to do, for the past several months. But all of those things are definitely going to bring the EU and the United States into the conflict, and all of their military assets will be then used against Iran. But what choice does Iran have? They're either going to, lose to Israel, or they're going to lose to everyone. But I mean, what choice do they have except for surrendering or fighting? I mean, it seems that they don't have too many options. And so, if they don't want to surrender, what kind of a strategy are they going to pursue? We're going to find out, of course, but I mean, is it likely they're going to drop out of the IAEA? Is it likely they're going to try very hard to produce a nuclear weapon and then threaten that? And then if they do that, I mean, is that just going to invite a nuclear attack from Israel and the United States?
Well, so I apologize for cutting out. So I want to finish that thought. I was going to say that in 2022, Russia was in very dire need of. I mean, even if you just look at it psychologically, they wanted international support, and Iran was one of the countries that stepped up to the plate, to use a baseball analogy. Sure. I remember in 2023 in the army, the Moscow Army Forum, where they show Russia's military technology, and that event they hold every year. In that particular year, they were really trying to make it an international event, and there were just not many countries that were willing to do it. I don't think even China was willing to show up at that event. I don't remember. I think the following year China did participate, but that year they did not. There were several random countries, but one of the biggest international partners in that forum was Iran. So, and at the time, because I think everybody underestimated what modern war was going to be like, Iran had a very good drone program. I think those of us who've been paying attention to Iran for the past several years already knew that. We knew Iran had an excellent drone program, and they shared it with Russia because they just didn't have enough native drone production. They said, here's this great design that works. We'll share you our existing stocks. We'll partner to build factories to produce that design in Russia itself. So I wouldn't downplay Iran's role in helping Russia a couple of years ago. And I think as far as developing nukes now, even if it's not formally announced, I think Iran is, as of right now, under, even if they don't publicly state it, I think there's enough back history between the two. And just if you look at the history between the two countries, they're under Russia's nuclear umbrella right now. I think they already are. So I think that in of itself because the problem is if you attack a country in a nuclear power's nuclear umbrella, you're inviting retaliation. I mean, and that's true for countries under the USA's umbrella. It's also true for countries under Russia's umbrella. So people are free to disagree with me on that, but I think it's known, even if it's not stated, I think every world leader at this point knows the status of every other country's nuclear umbrella. Can I nuke this country without getting nuked back? I think even if Trump and all those other people don't publicly state it, they know that because they've been told that behind closed doors. I think Iran cannot be nuked without getting nuked back. I do think there's enough evidence to say they're under Russia's nuclear umbrella as of right now. And I think
that's an interesting analysis. I wasn't prepared to engage. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. I'm suspicious that it might not be true, but it could be true too.
Well, I mean, think about what's the reason. I mean, the countries develop nukes if they're not already nuclearly protected, right? Because nuclear technology right now is not terribly difficult. I mean, even terrorists could develop a dirty bomb if they want to. So it's country like North Korea in the 1990s was not under anybody's nuclear protection. Because the Soviet Union had dissolved. So what do? They developed their own nuclear program because North Korea was an isolated country, not supported by anybody. So they developed that deterrent. I think Iran could develop a nuke if they wanted to, but at this point, they don't need to because they're under Russia's nuclear umbrella.
Okay, it's interesting that Netanyahu, one of the first things he allegedly wanted to do was to call Putin on the phone, right? So immediately Israel launched that attack, and then the reporting was that he wanted to get Putin on the phone. So yeah, exactly what they're discussing.
And it's interesting also that Netanyahu was apparently not even in Israel because there's that photo that went viral of his plane leaving Israel. It's kind of a Zelensky moment because it's known that Zelensky was talking from a green screen for a couple of months after the war in Ukraine started. It's kind of Netanyahu went to Cyprus, or there was speculation on which country he went to. It's probably Cyprus.
Yeah, well, yeah, I heard Greece, but we're speculation.
But yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think? He's telling Putin. What do you think he's anxious to talk to Putin about? Is he warning Putin? Is he trying to come to some agreement with Putin? I mean, I think Putin ought to be smart enough that what's going on. So again, and Berletic makes the point, because I was watching a couple hours of Berletic this morning. He makes the point that this isn't about Iran, right? This is about China. And, Iran and Russia are kind of stepping stones to China. I mean, everything is connected, but so he's making this point that it's about China in response to, the morons that are saying, Israel owns the United States and Israel's getting the United States to do Israel's bidding. When in actuality, that's a really silly analysis. And I agree with Berletic on that. And he's saying, no, this is the West. It's the ruling Western establishment who is, piece by piece picking off the axis of resistance, and it's going to culminate with China because the United States understands that China is their peer competitor, on the global stage, and things aren't going well with their efforts to take out Russia, but they did take out Syria, which is a stepping stone to Iran. Now they're going to try and take out Iran, which is going to weaken Russia, and they're just exerting this pressure against the axis of resistance. But it's going to, ultimately, China is the main competitor here, and so you got to see it not as the United States going to war for Israel, on Israel's behalf, like that's a kind of a silly analysis, and I totally agree with Berletic in that. But
I don't know if I agree because, well, it's hard to say because, well, so one, I think because Israel and Jews and Russia have a complex relationship, especially after the end of the Soviet Union, because after the end of the Soviet Union, those floodgates really opened, and Jews from Russia and particularly Ukraine, which I think people overlooked that the relationship between Ukraine and Israel isn't an accident, because a huge number of Ukrainians came to Israel. And from what I understand, even the normal rules on proving how Jewish you are before you immigrate to Israel were kind of waived for Ukrainians in particular. So it's an interesting, it's not an accidental relationship, but it's true for Russia also. So it's a complex relationship because there's a lot of people who originated from Russia in Israel. So and there's a lot of course, there's still Jewish people in Russia also, and they're not necessarily going to say, oh, let's tell Israel to fuck off. So it's a complex relationship. I think, and so Netanyahu allegedly calling Putin first makes sense because he kind of wants to say, well, how pissed off are you about this? How are you going to react to this? How are you going to respond to us? I mean, it's kind of a conversation that should have happened beforehand, but well, it is what it is. As far as the whole BRICS thing, I don't know. I'm still not sure what to think about BRICS. I do think if you have to defeat one country to get to another country, then it's not a stepping stone. So I think it's a flawed analogy. I also think people in Western Europe and the coastal states of the USA hate Russians to a much greater degree than they hate China. And I think I've said that in this show before. People that are closer to each other ethnically tend to hate each other more than people who are not close ethnically. So if you look at the relationship...
Hold on. That last point is not true at all. I mean, look at the violence.
Look at Korea and Japan.
Look at the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's the only racist law explicitly ever passed in the United States. Look at the overwhelming violence on the streets against Chinese people in the past few years. Look at the hate mongering. That last point is just blatantly not true at all. But on a bigger point, I fail to see how your earlier point about the post USSR or post 1917 immigration of Jewish people, ethnically Jewish people from Ukraine and Russia to Israel has anything to do with how with the geopolitical ultimate objective of the Anglo-U.S. empire to take out the only true threat to their hegemony, the only true threat to the permanent end of their hegemony is literally on the horizon, or not even on the horizon. It's approaching very, very fast, and it is solely because of China. I mean, Russia's move, even to defend itself, right, was made possible by prior agreements with China. I'm absolutely sure. I don't think Russia would have embarked on defending itself against NATO encroachment in such a way had they not known that China was behind them. I think this wave of everything that is happening today is the Sahel region in West Africa, the Ansar Allah fight against Israel, the resistance. I think all of this is sort of structurally, globally, world historically made possible by the sheer economic strength of a anti-imperialist power that is structurally spelling the end, permanent end of Anglo-U.S. hegemony, right? Not through funding rebel groups, not through any other means, but through a structural process, historical material process, right? So, I mean, yeah, I didn't really get how Jewish people
I can
emigrating
explain.
from the Russia, to Israel, how that contradicts this analysis.
I didn't say it contradicted. I brought it up in the relationship of not the West and Israel, but Israel and Russia and Ukraine. Because yes, there are a lot of Russian descended people in Israel right now, so I mean, just I will say the vast majority of Russians sympathize with Palestine, and they'll openly say that they sympathize with Palestinians over Israel.
Yeah,
But it's complicated because there's so many Russian descended people.
Sure. Yeah. There's an old school. There are some old school Zionists, even from like a long time ago. Like for example, Lavrov. I mean, love the guy, but on this one point, he's coming at it from a old school Russian sort of perspective, which is which is something else entirely. But
I bring up I brought up, and I know you disagree with it, but let me explain it. So like I'm going to bring up, like, for example, Korea and Japan. If you look at like what happens with Korea and South Korea in particular, and what actually precipitated the North Korean invasion of South Korea, is that their army, the South Korean army, was predominantly Japanese officers, officers from Imperial Japan, and they hated Koreans, and they killed hundreds of thousands of Korean people,
of Korean communists.
Right, and so that's why I say, I mean, yeah. So you can pass a law saying, oh, this ethnic group can't hold a job, or I don't like this ethnic group. I think people who are close, and I think there's basis for that theory that ethnic groups that are closer to each other hate each other more than ethnic groups that are farther apart in other ends of the world.
I'm not sure if that holds any water at all. Like, whether ethnic, it's a matter of ethnicity at all. I mean, there are plenty of counter examples to your theory.
Yeah,
it's really I mean, the underlying contradiction is class. The underlying contradiction.
Well, let me finish my argument.
Who's going to collaborate? Which Koreans are going to collaborate with the Anglo Empire, with the U.S. Empire, and which Koreans are not? Right? It's the Koreans that refused to collaborate that were massacred, right? That are demonized in the North today. I mean, the ones that collaborated, they were fine. They were not slaughtered in 1951. The ones that collaborated were absolutely fine, and they're still in power today. They're still in power in South Korea today.
Bring up an example with you. So actually this morning, me and my girlfriend, we went because yesterday was Russia Day, so it's a holiday period right now. So we went to the Moscow Borodino Museum, which was that famous battle in 1812 between Napoleon and the Russian Empire. And I didn't know the scale of that battle actually until I went to the museum today. And so it was 38,000 French and 43,000 Russian were killed and wounded. So basically 80,000 people were killed or wounded in one day. And that's you could call it a brother wars, because you had one group of European people who went and fought another group of European people. I will say, however much they hate Koreans or however much they hate Chinese or Filipinos, Europeans, even the most hardcore Nazi white nationalist guy in Europe is not going to say, oh, let's sacrifice 80,000 people to beat
No,
the Chinese, but they will say it for Russia. It's a brother war because
I think you're looking at it through this lens exclusively, and everything seems to fall into it, but it's not true at all. I mean, the Germans worked with the Japanese. The U.S. funded the Japanese fascist colonial war machine in the first 3 years of the conflict, like Standard Oil. What later became Chevron, funded 80% of Japanese war machines' energy needs in the first 3 years. And I mean, racial hatred, especially between that as an explanatory model, I just find that highly suspicious. Like, there are plenty of counter examples. I mean, China never went to war with Korea,
So
since 1720, and that was a very brief.
Well, China hasn't really gone to war too much with anybody, though. I mean, I wouldn't say, China. I mean, to your credit, definitely, but China isn't exactly the most warmongering.
Sure. But I think the narcissism of small differences is very much a factor in people who like the same kind of music, but just a little bit different. But when it comes to nation states, I think the causation is not race, it's not ethnicity, it's not racial hatred. It's material.
Well, I mean, sure. Okay, sure. I mean, there's class theory. I'm not saying Marx was wrong. I mean, I'm not saying, Marx was an idiot.
But the underlying cause of conflict.
Well, I mean, even look at Ukrainians and Russians. I mean, no one can fucking tell. I mean, let's be honest. No one on the outside can tell the difference between a Ukrainian and a Russian.
Exactly. That's why Russia was so hesitant in launching this operation, the special military operation. And even after they launched it, they held back. They went in with kid gloves because these are their brothers, right? It's not ethnic hatred. It's that Ukraine was instrumentalized and weaponized to become a bulwark against Russia by the Anglo-U.S. Empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that there was a coup, and their sovereignty was destroyed, and a far-right, rabidly anti-Russia, anti-communist, let's call it what it is, far-right fascist group took power, and Russia waited until the last minute. Putin could have, should have, many argue, intervened much earlier. So this, similarity of ethnic, narcissism of small differences when it's applied to such conflicts, I'm not sure makes sense.
So let me
let me jump in. I haven't been.
But anyway, China. I thought we were going to talk about
interesting discussion. The exact. How to understand ethnicity, how to understand how ethnicity, the role that ethnicity plays in global conflict. I mean, I would agree with Leo that, ethnicity is exactly, it's a real thing. Like there's differences, there's genetic differences among people, and those differences can be weaponized in the furtherance of the class interests,
And some of those differences are fictional as well, because Ashkenazi Jews, they're literally Germans, they're literally French and Polish,
no, I believe that
they're not Middle Eastern, they're not West Asian at all. And the same thing for Arabs. What is an Arab? There are 1,000 different ethnicities in the West Asia which are lumped together as Arab.
So these are ideas though that can be manipulated and I think used to further the interests of the ruling elites. And even Putin, he tries to rally the Russian ethnicity, and he declares himself the defender and protector of Russian people. And so, he engages in that same kind of, ethnic approach to things that I wish people would stay away from, because ultimately, it's one humanity, and we need to, as a species, figure out how we can progress beyond this exploitative,
Well, I think in Russia's case, in Putin's case, it was not avoidable. It was the only way to unite Russia. and unity was of central importance when in the early 2000s.
If he would have tried to rally around communism and socialism,
It
he
would have
might
failed.
not be nearly as effective. And so that's
Absolutely. At that time,
correct.
exactly, in the early 2000s, post 1990s, with the situation of the world being what it was, as well as within Russia, and he needed a unity of the national bourgeoisie, and so anyway.
But there's nationalism, and then there's a racism here that's tied to imperialism, right? I mean, Ukrainian racial sciences believes Russians are ethnically different. Mongolian, that's pretty much inherited from Germany. And I think the Korea-Japan thing is Japanese imperialism, which is similar, very racist.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, these ethnicities are weaponized, and the propaganda is utilized to gain support and to push these, these differences. And I mean, you could see that in World War I. There was a lot of anti-German propaganda being pushed, demonizing the German race. But again, these are antiquated ideas that science has kind of disproven. About these, distinct genetic races, and there was how many races were there officially regarded during World War I? It was like,
here's my thing. So we can argue Marxist theory. The problem is that we're talking about a real world scenario, saying that they hate China more than Russia. The problem is that
it's not hate. It's not hate, right? It's never hate. In fact, colonialism was never about hate. It was never hatred of Black Africans. It was about indifference. It was indifference to their humanity, which was necessary for the extraction and exploitation of African natural and human resources, right? It was never hatred. Like the colonial powers were never never shied away from having sex with African people. Never shied away from, even though they passed laws against it for the population because they wanted to stoke the fires of racism. But they never stopped enjoying African music, Africanized music. In fact, the rumbas from Cuba, the Afro-Cuban rumbas in the 1930s, was a rage in Nazi Germany. Like the top SS officers loved rumba. They couldn't resist. I mean, it was never about hatred. It was never ever about ethnic hatred. It was about indifference. It was about cold calculation of economic interest. And in order to realize the economic goals, right, the geopolitical power and economic power of empire, they needed to create racism, create the idea of a race, and use that in order to accomplish their goals. And so yeah.
Well, I think that proves what I said, though. I think even like the American Civil War, which was literally about the slavery of African descended people, is a true statement that whites in the North and whites in the South hated each other more than anybody hated the African slaves.
Why would they hate each other? Why would the German and English, the only reason they hated each other was because of the economic model that they disagreed on, because the North was industrializing, right? And their economy was no longer dependent on chattel slavery. And they wanted to advance this new industrialized capitalism, this new modern form of capitalism, which the East Coast money was invested in, right? And so the South was holding them back with this like antiquated this antiquated form of like slavery capitalism was holding them back. And this is one of the primary reasons that they hated each other. Otherwise, why would they hate each other? Like the East and the Southern plantation colonial, English and German descendants, why else would they hate each other?
The idea that hate just exists organically outside of any material objective and effort to stoke the hatred and to focus it on a certain people at a certain time, that's just it's a silly way of trying to explain why things are as they are.
Have you read Gone with the Wind or watched the movie?
It's
interesting if you watch the movie. It's interesting because even though Gone with the Wind is very much a slavery it's absolutely a slavery apologist movie.
Yeah.
I think the most fascinating thing about it is that the slaves, the blacks themselves, are not portrayed negatively. The people who are portrayed negatively is the Irish, those Irish Northern soldiers. Like they're portrayed as, it actually is interesting because they're portrayed very much like Russians are portrayed now. They're portrayed as rapists, drunk, and
sure. But that's for a variety of reasons, a variety of other reasons.
I mean, like I'll tell you
that
about
portrayal might actually be accurate. That's the one race that I'm willing to denounce is the
Irish. Oh my gosh. Okay, so like I went to school. I went to Russian language classes with this Turkish guy in Moscow a couple of years ago, and like I remember we were walking to the metro, and like he kind of like carefully, because he didn't know my opinion was. He asked me what I thought. He literally, what do you think? He asked me, what do you think about Arabs? And I was kind of like, as one of those questions, like, oh, I need to answer carefully. So I was kind of like, well, Arabs are okay. They're not the most industrious people in the world, maybe, but I like Arabs. But that's literally my answer, because I was kind of like, I don't want, I'm kind of like, I don't know where this is going. And he went on this like 20-minute rant about how he hates Arabs. But let's be honest, the rest of us, looking from the outside, Turks and Arabs, for other people are not that different.
What does that have to do with anything? Like
ethnic groups that are neighboring.
But literally, what does that have to do with anything? I'm sorry. Like, what does that have to do with anything? What is that like? Arabs were incredibly industrious. Most of the Pythagoras theorem.
My point is that Turks and Arabs don't like each other.
Astronomical.
But Ian, again, like what's the point of that? Okay, Turks and Arabs, there's animosity there, there's a history there, and that history manifests itself in certain people's opinions. But I
don't think French and Germans are going to die by the millions fighting Chinese. I don't think they will. But I think they would die by the millions fighting Russians, because they hate Russians. They don't hate Chinese like they hate Russians. And they have died by the millions fighting Russians before, more than once. But they've never died by the millions fighting China.
Well,
I think
okay. So, again, that's just, it's an interesting opinion, but it really doesn't explain anything. It just appeals to these inherent stereotypes of that people are just, genetically predisposed to certain behaviors. And again, like that's not a sensible explanation for why things are the way they are. Now, I'm certain that we can create the material conditions that would cause, Europeans to go fight China. Like those conditions can be created if there's a will to do that, and there's funding to engage in that.
Italians, were defeated by Ethiopia, in 1903 or whatever, and then they came back, right, and rained chemical weapons on the Ethiopian warriors. Of course, Europeans would go to war on a massive scale against people that are genetically very different from them. I just don't
understand against China.
The explanation.
Well, it's a sacrifice.
So the reality is material conditions are what drives these events, the material conditions, and those are determined by the interests of the powerful, the wealthy elites that control the media, control the military, control the politics and the policies. Those people determine who the enemy will be and where the propaganda will be targeted.
Well,
And so to say that because Germans could never be propagandized or marched into a war with somebody that's not white, like I don't know, that doesn't explain things.
I'm arguing it because there's no basis for the same. I mean, it's repeatedly come up in this show. Oh, Russia is just a stepping stone to China. Russia is a stepping stone to China. On what historical basis? I mean, because I mean, just add up the number of people who have died, been killed in wars between Russia and Western Europe. Millions, tens of millions of people have been killed.
Okay. So
yeah, I agree that Russia it's a target unto itself.
Right. I mean, because I think, like, look at the boxer. I mean, I think any war, I mean, there have been wars with China in the past, but I think I don't think it's even a controversial statement to say if in Britain or in France, if the casualties got too high, they would say, well, it's not worth it. It's China. We don't care that much about China. Bring the troops home. But Russia is this like historical enemy that they hate more than they value their own lives.
Historically, they've always coveted Russia's resources. They've always
right,
and Russia was never part of the English Empire, right? And the English Empire wanted domination over all of the Eurasian, all of Asia, all over the entire world, and Russia resisted. Even Imperial Russia resisted that. And they always coveted Russia's natural resources. If
Yeltsin or Navalny would be the current government in Russia, there would be no fight because Russia would join, the West's attack on China, and then there would be no problems with Russians, or everything would be great. But the problem is that Putin is not a pushover. Putin is demanding sovereignty. He's making his own decisions about what is best for Russia, and that those decisions are opposed to what the West has in mind and what the West wants. But so all the literature, all the think tanks talk about a division of labor, and they talk about a sequencing of conflicts, right? Because the United States, the West, is faced with this existential crisis of a axis of resistance led by China, and they have to figure out a way to deal with it. And so their strategy involves dividing, division of labor is what the term that is used in the think tank literature, and that essentially means that the United States can't do everything everywhere, and so they're kind of handing over the Ukraine docket to Europe, right? They're trying to deal with Iran with Israel, and then the United States really wants to pivot to China and to start focusing on weakening China and destroying China's ability.
There's China again. I told you. That's why I was arguing so much about it. Why are they going to pivot to China? Who cares more about China than
let me ask you this. So like all the literature and all the think tanks that are claiming that China is their number one adversary and we have to defeat China, like what is that about? Like, who is funding that? Why is it their number one talking point? Why is there congressional legislation condemning China, all that stuff, if they have no interest in containing China? I'm just perplexed.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian, the root cause that Putin and Lavrov and everyone in Russia always talks about of the special military operation, the root cause of the West's hatred of Russia, right? Mm-hmm. We have to remember that Western press, Western media was very positive about Russia in the 90s. Western media loved Russia. They loved Putin in the first years before Putin turned on them. When they thought that Putin,
when they thought Russia was dying,
is
when they were
comprador. When they thought Putin would play ball.
Well, it's not just comprador. It's not just comprador.
Hand over the keys to the Russian empire.
I remember exact conversation my father
told
me.
Senior George Bush Senior called Putin a stand-up guy.
Let me tell you about China. Listen to me for a minute.
They did not hate Putin. The West did not hate Putin, nor did they hate Russia until Russia began to, one, nationalize their industry and kicking out the Western corporations' control, and two, started helping Syria.
Well, so let me tell you about when I was a kid. I was probably 9 or 10, and I asked I don't even remember what the context was, but I asked my father, "What's wrong with Russia? What's going on in Russia?" He said, "Oh, Russia is dying." Like he said it so casually. "Oh, Russia is dying." Like in the 1990s, my father was completely convinced.
And
that Russia was going to cease to exist. And yes. So saying, oh, well, they were buddies with Yeltsin or they were buddies with Putin. Well, they were buddies with them because they thought Russia was going to be extinct. So no one's ever talked about Chinese going extinct. I mean, yes, they've talked about subordinating China and making the Chinese vassals, because they see them as, racially inferior.
What? Extinct? No, Russians were never going to become extinct.
They were absolutely talking about Russians being extinct in the 1990s. If you look at the literature, they were saying, look at the birth rate, look at the abortion rate. Russians are going to extinct. There'll just be no Russians. We can colonize their lands. It's Lebensraum. That was absolutely the attitude. Look at the literature in the 1990s or even like 2001, 2002.
I can show you plenty of literature that talked about Russian oil. I can show you plenty of literature talking about
to control the resources. They wanted the Russia to be divided up into many little statelets like Yugoslavia, for sure, because they don't they don't want a powerful central government that resists their imperialist drive to control the resources, and also to use against China, because I know Russia and China do share a border, but and of course in the 2000s they weren't thinking in terms of China. Thinking in terms of China, it really started happening around 2013 because nobody saw what China has accomplished. They never thought that was possible, but in starting in about 2013, the West becomes to be cognizant of this threat that China posed, and that again, so it's just weird. So, I'm just trying to understand your position, Ian. And it sounds like that you're saying that, global events are being driven by an irrational hatred of Russian people. And that's what it is. And that the West just has this irrational hatred of Russian people, and we're trying to genocide and make them extinct. And that is the primary driver. So it has nothing to do with
that's the mainstream view, even in Russia right now. Like if you ask Russians, what's going on? Why is there this conflict between Western countries and Russia? And they'll say, well, there's this irrational hatred of Russians.
Well, they would be wrong.
They
would be wrong.
Because they lost their
I don't think they're wrong. Because they hated Russia during the Soviet Union. So during the Soviet Union, and I think even like in the 1970s,
that was anti-communism.
You could say,
but they loved Russia in the 90s.
But they hate Russia in the 90s.
Look at Western press about Russia. Look at Western press about Russia in the 90s. Look at the earliest Western politicians talking about Putin before he showed himself to be non-compliant, right? They were positive about Putin. They were positive about Russia. They loved the West.
They loved Russia.
They love Navalny. They love Navalny. They love Gorbachev.
They love Navalny.
It's the nature of the leadership. If they had a compliant leadership, they would love Russians.
Right. It's about whether the oil.
I didn't realize.
I've never. I don't know where this pseudo history is coming from, because all my life I've never remembered anyone in Western countries. I do remember people in Western countries rejoicing that Russia.
Look up what George Bush Sr. Look up what George Bush Sr. said about Putin.
Well, of course, when you think someone is destroying the country, Russia, they're going to be positive about it. Just like positive about.
Why would all of our biggest rock stars go play at the Moscow Music Peace Festival? And why would we show all these Russians loving our music? Like it was perestroika. It was a time of unity, and it was all a lie to conquer Russia and take its resources. It wasn't a lie to genocide Russia.
Well, you don't need Russians to take Russian resources. It's Lebensraum.
So
Hitler didn't say, I need Russian people. Hitler never said, "I need Russian people." He said he needs Russian resources. He needs Russian.
Of course, and that was his. He had this racial ideology, and that was absolutely his goal, was to genocide the Russians and colonize Russia with Germans. Absolutely.
I mean, look at before Hitler, when the French came to Russia, they would break into Orthodox churches, and they would use the they're not crucifixes. I'm sorry, I forget the Orthodox group, but they would take crosses, they would take icons and use them to cut meat and bread. Like they would specifically break into Russian churches to defile their icons. So there is a hatred here. There is a European hatred of Russians.
Yeah, because they've always coveted Russian resources. I mean, even ChatGPT, yeah, it says in the 1990s, trained on Western media. Yeah, in the 1990s, Western media often portrayed Russia with fascination, especially during the post-Soviet transition, highlighting its cultural shifts and political changes. This period was marked by a mix of optimism and curiosity about Russia's potential for democracy and market reforms, despite challenges it faced. West was very positive, very optimistic about Russia will become one of its vassals.
Yeah.
Well, Russia would be depopulated. I mean, and actually that's a Ukrainian nationalist.
Look at the other vassals. They're not depopulated. Japan was
never who's not? Well, I mean, the Baltic
states. The U.S. helped. The U.S. funded the reconstruction of Japan, of South Korea after the war.
Well, Japan is
funded the reconstruction of Germany. The U.S. funded the reconstruction of Germany.
Korea has the lowest.
And if Russia had become a vassal state, if Russian government had been compliant, had become a vassal state, the U.S. would have funded Russia's reconstruction.
I mean, I just ask you, who's not going extinct? You cited South Korea and Japan. Those two countries literally have the lowest birth rates in the world. South Korea,
but that's for other reasons. That's not.
And what does that have to do with going extinct?
That's imperialist.
Nobody's going extinct. Japanese people aren't going extinct, and neither are Russian people. But guys, okay, here's the thing. This is an interesting debate. I wasn't aware of Ian's position, and I wasn't prepared to, have this debate about the primary drivers of, world events. I'm a little bit. It's interesting to hear, this counter explanation. But what I'm saying is, it won't be long before, Ian will have to explain why China's in the crosshairs. And like MK was saying earlier, well, it's the Russians are dying now, not Chinese. Okay, well, that's true. There's a sequencing of conflicts here. There's a strategy in play. You can read about it in all the think tank literature, but it won't be long before there is a pivot to China, before we do start seeing things ramp up in the South China Sea,
okay, let's read
Taiwan, and we're gonna see, Chinese people dying. And so at that point, I hope people will come around to me and Leo's position, because, to hear you guys' position, that's not going to happen. And I know it will happen. And when it does, I think it'll demonstrate which one of us has the correct
June
understanding.
13th now. It's June 13th now. So June next year, we will see who's right. If there's
no war, it would be If there is no war, it would be because China has prepared itself, has outmaneuvered the colonial empire in terms of the structural capacities for war. If there is no war, but the arming, the heavy militarization of the island chains around China, the heavy militarization of Taiwan, of the Philippines, of South Korea. Right? Why does the U.S., keep a massive military force in South Korea? Right? Why? Why is the South Korean military answerable only to the United States? All of this is for war against China. All of this, billions and billions, tens, hundreds of billions of U.S. dollars spent over the last decades arming these countries. Why? There's no other reason other than war against China in the eventuality of war against China.
And all the people in positions of power all agree that China is the primary competitor and rival. Everybody
North
says
Korea
that.
is also a neighbor of Russia.
North Korea is a neighbor of Russia. I mean, that's true.
And
No, I'm just saying it's not just China. I mean, I do respect North Koreans for what they suffered. I mean, it's horrific what they've suffered. And I do think there is hatred for North Koreans. Like I see it because I write a lot. I get about 1 million views on Korea. I'm not saying it to flex, but I get a lot of trolls. I probably get several thousand trolls a month. And, and the things they say about Korean people, I can't even repeat here. They're disgusting. The things they say about Koreans. These are Americans. These are English. It's usually Americans and British. It's disgusting. And the things that they say about Chinese people is disgusting. The things they say about Koreans is disgusting. So I'm not so when I say, the primary focus is ethnic hatred of Russians, I don't mean to downplay their hatred of Chinese people or Korean. I do not mean
but
to
the
be
West
offensive
doesn't.
that way at all.
But the West loves Japan, and
Well,
in fact, the West
the
loves
Philippines.
South Korea.
They occupy Japan. I mean,
they occupy South Korea, and the Japanese government is.
If we occupied Russia, we'd love Russia,
and they would love Russia.
The things they did to Japan are horrific. Like
the things they did to Russia are horrific.
They occupy. I mean, the crucial difference between Russia and Japan is that they've successfully occupied Japan. Even in the 1990s, they never successfully.
Precisely. That's why they do not hate Japanese people, and that's why.
Well, I mean, they rape.
So it's the relationship to imperialism.
I mean, if you read what the American and British and Australian armies did to Japanese civilians, particularly girls, it's horrific. Horrific.
Sure, and if you read what the German Nazis did to Russians in 1943, it's also fucking horrific as fuck. I mean, none of this,
Right. So I mean, so when I say they specifically hate Russians more, I don't mean to downplay what they've done to other people.
Yeah, but that's just not a driving factor. The only ethnic tensions, innate hatred of other ethnicities. That's not what is driving world events, right?
That literally
what's driving world events is a Western global elite that has had global hegemony since 1945, but especially since 1991 or 92 when the Soviet Union dismantled, and they thought, hey, we're it. We're going to be 1,000-year Reich. It's the end of history. And then China popped up out of nowhere, just starting to displace Western global hegemony. And so now there's a response to that. And that response is, what we're seeing play out before us yesterday with Iran. That's not just about Iran. It's not about the United States doing Israel's bidding. It's not about that. Like it's a global conflict, and the conflict has sides. And it's the West and Europe and Israel, Australia, Japan, South Korea on one side, and the axis of resistance on the other. And there's all these countries in between, and the West is trying very hard to get a new Cold War and to get the vast majority of the countries on its side to isolate China, destroy Russia, destroy Iran, and destroy anyone that resists their global hegemony. I mean, that's what's going on. But if you don't understand that China and their growth and their economic power and their alternative system, which again is a threat to the U.S. because countries aren't forced to go to the IMF. They're not forced to go to the World Bank. They can, China can facilitate development in those countries. They can depend on China for loans. And so, and this is a threat to their economic domination and their political domination of the planet. And so, they've put their, their target on China to contain China, to weaken China. And to do that, they've got to start peeling off the smaller fruits first. And I'm sorry that Russian people take offense to that, but they shouldn't, because it's just the reality. Russia is not displacing U.S. global hegemony around the globe. They are not, developing Africa. They're not developing Central and South America.
Russia is developing Africa.
Okay.
Russia is developing Central.
No. Russia is playing an anti-imperialist role. That's why I support Russia.
There's a degree,
Absolutely.
Ian. There's degrees to which they're doing it, and the degree to which China is doing it is a threat. The degree to which Russia is developing Africa isn't threatening U.S. interests in Africa. I mean, it is.
Yeah,
you could say.
Look at the automobile industry. What's happening in the automobile industry in EVs? Look at renewable energy technology.
Yeah.
Look at AI. Look at anything. Look at robotics. China is ending the 500 years old colonial empire very rapidly, like permanently putting it to bed, like burying it 1,000 feet under the ground, never to rise again. If the colonial empire doesn't do anything, doesn't start a war.
So no, and I mean Russian partisans shouldn't take offense to that, right? Russian partisans ought to be clear-eyed about the global dynamics and not see everything through an ethnic lens where it's just, the West just hates Russian people. Like, that doesn't explain anything. There's actual drivers, material drivers that are behind what we're seeing play out, and to chalk it up to ethnicity it's ignorant. I mean,
On a philosophical level, hatred. On a philosophical level, like, ethnic hatred does not exist without other drivers, without material factors, without power, with power relationships.
Weaponizing it, harnessing it, facilitating it, turning it into something that can be used to further other interests.
Well, no, I would love to see Russian soldiers, or excuse me, the Chinese helping, against the French in Africa or against NATO in Ukraine. But right now, it's the Russians fighting. I mean, again, when we circle back, as Jen liked to say, the former U.S. press secretary liked to say, we'll circle back to that. I feel like we'll circle back to that in a year. But right now, it's the Russian blood right now. So obviously, someone in Russia. I mean, I'm not saying I do it.
Big up Russian.
Yes.
No,
so
absolutely.
That's Ian's valid point. Is China's foreign policy is docile relative to Russia.
Well, it's not docile. It's different. It's a structural.
And China's
strategy.
not under attack.
Yeah,
Russia
right.
is under attack.
But militarily,
there's a sequencing.
Because it's a different strategy. It's not a military
strategy.
It's an economic and geopolitical strategy.
Right.
It's not a militarist strategy. It's not docile. It's not passive. It's very, very actively, structurally changing the world, reshaping global trade, right? Like from the trade perspective.
I'm distinguishing the ire that Russia gets from what China gets.
Right, and I think we're going to see that change. I think when you're the West and you're faced with these rising challenges, you develop a strategy and you develop a sequence for dealing with those threats. And so last night, it was Iran that was on the receiving end. It was Russia, a couple of years ago and continuing to today. But I mean, to assume that China is not ever going to be in the crosshairs just because they're not in the crosshairs now. Like, I don't understand that at all. And time will tell, it's tough for me to convince someone who thinks otherwise because, we haven't seen it. And so we don't see Chinese people dying. So if your argument is, well, Russians are dying now, I mean, sure, but I mean, there was a time when Russians weren't dying, and does that mean that they didn't hate Russians? Like,
when
it's
were
faulty
Russians
logic.
not dying?
Not
Let
a
me ask you this:
persuasive.
when were Russians not dying? Because they were definitely dying in the 1990s. There were, if you ask, in fact, a few months ago. Actually, no, Russians will tell you that the 1990s were the worst humanitarian disaster in Russian history besides World War II. So it's not an accurate statement to say Russians were not dying. They were dying. Like if you ask a Russian person who was alive in the 1990s, they'll tell you, if you go into the metro station, it was full.
Well, yeah, obviously, but that's not okay. First of all, okay, that's not the worst humanitarian disaster. The Congo was the worst humanitarian.
Well, we mean in Russian history,
exponentially worse than what happened in Russia, actually, in the 1990s and early 2000s. In the Congo, there's 5 million direct war deaths in the Congo. Like, that's literally the worst humanitarian disaster since World War II. Exponentially bigger than what happened to Russia, if you want to go play that game. I mean,
yeah, it's an interesting. I'm glad people are expressing appreciation for the discussion. We never know where our discussion will end up. We actually were planning on talking about something totally different. We were going to talk about China's history, China's decisions, and China's choices, and that would be a good. We're obviously going to have that discussion in a future date. But with what happened with Iran last night, we kind of changed our topic. But Greg and Leo both had a lot to say about China's evolution, China's development, and China's political choices vis-a-vis, moving away from, total socialism and towards embracing capitalist markets, Western investment, etc. So I have a lot to say on that topic, and I know Leo and Greg did. We were going to have that discussion today. Current events changed that. And then we got sidetracked into this other debate. And so I appreciate that the viewers have expressed enjoyment at the discussion. I'm happy that they're not, bored to tears. And I wasn't prepared. Like I didn't really understand Ian's perspective, his position clearly. And it always strikes me as, I struggle to come up with a response because I wasn't prepared for it. And
well, it's not Marx. And I'll just say I'm never offended on the show. I'm not like, oh, that person disagrees with me. I hate that person. I don't come from. I'm the minority, not Marxist person here. So I don't look through the Marx. I understand. I think I understand. I've read Marx. I understand the Marxist lens. I don't speak from that viewpoint, but I understand the Marxist lens. So I offer a minority opinion, but I'm not. It's always good to have that debate. I don't agree with everything.
It's interesting, and it's important, I think, because Ian does say, and I take him at his word, that a lot of people in Russia share his belief that it's like an irrational hatred of Russians that is driving the West's attacks against Russia. It's interesting. And if that's true, then we need to have these kinds of discussions. We need to have these kind of open
If anything, that's a handicap.
Say that again.
And we are not denying the centuries-old anti-Slavic racism of Europeans. Not at all. Not at all. But this is a fundamental philosophical difference here. I mean, ethnic hatred and racism is created by material forces. It's created. It doesn't exist naturally. Look at children. Look at literally children. There's no ethnic hatred between people unless there's power based on ownership involved, unless there's material interest of that power structure based on ownership involved. Then racism is ethnic hatred is trotted out, or it's.
And I think Ian argues that genetic diversity, is.
Well, I'm not saying that one person is black or one person's white or one person's whoever means they automatically hate each other. It's culture that drives into it. I'm not saying economic and power structures don't play into it, and people in positions of power don't manipulate hatred. Like, I'm not saying people in power, like in the Crusades, say, well, let's
But you think
manipulate
ethnic hatred
religious.
But you think ethnic hatred is an independent force, causal factor, is it independent of other factors?
Well, it depends what you mean by independent, as in a person in the absence of other factors will hate someone based on cultural differences. I mean, there is Catholic and Orthodox animosity. That is a true statement.
But that's
There
not
is.
ethnic. That's not ethnic. That's
Well, it is
ideological,
because religion. Because
Ideological
what is the difference between Western Slavs and Eastern
Yo, look.
Slavs? There's no difference at all except religion. Poles converted to Catholicism.
Exactly. Religion, ethnicity. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, just look at the most vibrant trade region on this earth for 1,000 years before European colonialism, the East Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean, right, which connected East Africa, Arab countries, Persia, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, right? This is the most active trade routes in the world, right, for 1,000 years before European colonialism. And these people, for sure, they made fun of each other, like, ooh, they smell funny. Their food tastes funny. Their music, like, maybe it's not as good as ours, but they never, ever killed each other en masse. Never.
I can't.
It really did not happen
for the Indian Ocean. I can't because I'm not too familiar with the history.
Right, but these trade routes. I mean, the Silk Road, yeah, was a part of it. The Silk Road is an extension of the Indian Ocean, right? And people along the trade routes, when there is no empire, when there's no material interest of empire to expand and to enslave, to take more land, to take more slaves, people do not hate each other.
I mean, I'll just say the Mediterranean was constant warfare for the last probably 3,000 years.
For the last 3,000 years, yeah. Empire. Empire is based on ownership of land and of slaves. Material interest.
Okay,
it's a good discussion.
1 hour and 42 minutes in. It's always interesting to see where our discussions end us. Wendy Jackson would like to definitely watch our episode discussing China, which maybe we can do next week, guys.
Next time.
But yeah, let's hope. I don't know how Iran is going to navigate this current situation, this current crisis. It seems inevitable that whatever they do, either they surrender now, or they're going to be, Europe and U.S. is going to join the attack on them. Do they have the capability to resist that? I mean, I think that's the ultimate question. I was convinced that they did at one point, and time will tell. I'm optimistic.
I think our Friday episode will probably have an answer. Tuesday is probably too early, but Friday is probably when we might
have a good answer. And I think by this time next year, I think we'll have a lot of movement towards China, and maybe the Chinese won't be dying in a year, but it's going to be set up. And so I think this time next year, I'll take your apology again.
We'll see how it goes. All right.
Okay. All right. Yeah. We will reconvene on Tuesday, hopefully. Thank you very much, and we'll see everybody then. Bye-bye.